and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to your opinions, your drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Now that I've made you as uncomfortable as possible, this week I'd like to briefly examine the presence of, let's say, horniness in Warcraft, because it interests me and I wanted an excuse to draw the Eridar twins. Though, just to get it out of the way, I'm not going to be focusing on darker sexual elements, such as what happened to Alexstrasza and Tyrannostraz. I'm also not going to give much attention to implied benign stuff, like the fact that Durak and Amarez existing proves that Thrall and Agra both popped lust at the same time. And I'm also not going to particularly focus on orientation or gender identity, though of course they may come up. I'm talking examples of sexual stuff that exists either for comedy or for titillation, and this has frankly been a thing since the very beginning. I mean, look at this early artwork of Garona. The franchise's origins felt very Conan the Barbarian. To try to deny that would mean being willfully ignorant, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. My list is going to be mostly the things that I can personally remember, though not entirely, and I'll be moving mostly chronologically. Before I get into specifics, I may as well address the Elec in the Room. That was the time period around patch 9.1.5, when Blizzard was essentially playing damage control for the sexual misconduct revelations. And I'll be honest, that patch was a huge inspiration for this video, as it removed or changed a lot of stuff. Some of it I absolutely agree with, especially references to the scummier participants in that whole scandal, and possibly even just some of the work they implemented. But Blizzard's solution still left a bad taste in my mouth. Not as bad a taste as the misconduct, obviously, but they clearly overcorrected. Changes should have been done with a scalpel, but instead they utilized a sledgehammer. I always look to one change in particular for why I feel this way: the Maximilian of Northshire quests in Ungoro Crater, which have you going around rescuing damsels from distress, and really just playing into Maximilian's foolishness. Well, those damsels were all changed to be town dwellers, which means someone on the team doesn't recognize a Don Quixote reference and actually got offended by use of the word damsel. And that change just got pushed through, which leads me to believe all suggestions were being approved without review. It's absolutely not the worst change Blizzard has ever made, but to me it always felt like the most brain-dead one. Anywho's it, I'll be referencing this patch, the Remember What They Took From Us patch, quite frequently going forward. So right off the bat, in vanilla, we had a smorgasbord of humorous jokes and flirts for the different races and genders of the game that would continue to be added to with each additional race, and with Demon Hunters specifically. By and large, they were very innocuous, if perhaps not something you'd want to be playing when your mother walked into your room. Some of them were admittedly pretty lame, or became functionally outdated over the years, but the majority had some genuine entertainment value. Unfortunately, almost 10 minutes worth of them were removed around 9.1.5. I'm obviously not going to include all of them here, but there are compilation videos out there that are easy enough to find, and I recommend you check them out. They'll make you laugh, and then you'll get sad that they're gone. I mean, "Nice pants, what's the drop rate?" is a classic, and you want to know the worst part? They didn't even remove the most offensive emote in the game, which is the one where female Nightborn comment on how good Tyrande looks. We also can't forget the existence of succubi, which do succubi things. It's mostly left to the imagination, though there are a few examples we get to see of characters getting into overt relationships with them. Succubi are technically members of the Syad race, and were especially of note as they're a summonable warlock pet useful for crowd control. This spell was updated in Shadowlands in what was actually a widely accepted improvement, that being that you now get to toggle between summoning a succubus or an incubus. I think that's wonderful, though I personally glyph mine to be a Shavara because they look better and 6 hands are better than 2, if you know what I mean. Also somewhat common throughout WoW's early years was the inclusion of paintings as decoration that sometimes featured provocatively dressed or positioned women. These were never really attractive and had fewer pixels than something that's been screenshotted 50 times. Still, when one of these models was modified in 9.1.5 to instead be a bowl of fruit, it sparked amusing commentary on how Blizz was trying to fix sexism by replacing women with fruit. It's honestly one of the changes I cared the least about, but it's pretty funny. The Burning Crusade's first raid, Karazhan, featured a small wing leading up to the Maiden of Virtue, populated by promiscuous partygoers, many of which were banshees or satyrs in disguise, with names such as Hostess, Mistress, and Paramour, almost certainly intended as an ironic contrast to the boss they were serving as trash for. These were also changed, and, in my opinion, for the better, as they now include male participants as well. A similar area exists for the 7th boss of Black Temple, Mother Sharaz the Shavara. This subzone is known as the Den of Mortal Delights, and quite famously included large packs of women with titles such as concubine and courtesan. They, as well as many of the succubus and Shavara mobs overseeing them, were renamed to less suggestive titles like Acolyte and Patron. Many of them were changed to be somewhat less scantily clad, and a portion of them were changed to be men. Again, I think including men was a good change, and the rest is rather pointless. Also, lots of people like to joke that Illidan was one horny dude, and to be fair, he does have large horns, but I don't think he partook in any of this. He was way too hung up on Tyrande, and likely just allowed this to exist because it ultimately benefited his plans. Shortly thereafter, we had the Sunwell Plateau raid, and notably, the Eridar twins encounter. The twins don't actually have much going on that's overtly sexual, no harems or anything surrounding them. But to me, they always felt like the mobs that existed for erotic reasons. I mean, just look at what the devs dressed them in. And the fact that they're twins, which is always fetishized. And the fact that they're in the Witch's Sanctum. I mean, it's not on the level of vampires, but witches are kind of tied to sexuality. Anyway, the twins, Lady Sacrolash and Grand Warlock Alethis, were basically our first look at a female Eridar model. And I think it's a little lame that when Minari Eridar were added, they were just red paint Draenei customization, and not a separate race that uses actual Eridar models like the twins and Archimonde and Kil'jaeden. Alas. Wrath of the Lich King added quite a few innuendos through the Sons of Hodir and their daily quests. These include the quests Blowing Hodir's Horn, Polishing the Helm, Raising Hodir's Spear, and Thrusting Hodir's Spear. All of them were renamed with 915 to be less sexual, which seems really pointless to me. Innuendos already kind of disguise their true nature to those unfamiliar with them, so this just felt like removing fun. Also, there was a Jormungandr worm renamed to Your Cutter from Your Mother, since it was apparently supposed to be a Your Mother joke, which I never really picked up on. Patch 3.3.2 added the Big Love Rocket mount to Love is in the Air. The name is, of course, mildly suggestive, and the icon was a little bit phallic, but ultimately it was a rocket, and it was big, and it was love-themed, so I think it was fine. 915 changed the icon as well as the name to X45 Heartbreaker, which I think would have been fine if it had been implemented that way, but I'ma just keep calling it the Big Love Rocket. Mists of Pandaria added the fishing supply vendor at the Angler's Wharf called Master Baiter. This was eventually changed to Jiangzuya, which I guess is actually a pretty clever reference to a Chinese proverb, so I appreciate the thought that went into the change, even if I dislike the censorship. The Throne of Thunder raid had the twin consorts as its penultimate boss. They are Lu Lin, who is moon-themed, and Suen, who is sun-themed. Female Mogu weren't really a thing otherwise, and they were crafted by Lei Shen to serve as his guards and to serve him. Before 915, they were described in the Dungeon Journal as his treasures and trophies. The entry was changed, and so was their title, which now became the Twin Empyreans. Funnily enough, in the game's files, they're known as the Imperial Queens, so if they'd just gone live with that name, they wouldn't have had to later be changed, though it is nice to see the Imperial part remained. Other female Mogu would later appear in the 8.3 version of Veil of Eternal Blossoms. Interestingly, one area in which horniness could have been explored but really wasn't, was with the Sha, which were clearly inspired by the 7 deadly sins. We never got a Sha of Lust, even though pandas are endangered and notoriously apathetic towards sex. I think a Sha of Lust could have done a lot to help their numbers out. But instead we got 3 minor variations of Angry. Another take on the 7 deadly sins would happen with the Court of Harvesters for the Venthyr and Shadowlands. The closest to Lust we got was Desire, whose harvester was the Countess. There does seem to be some mild sexual undertones, though Desire in this context is used far more broadly, and not just wanting to tap that. Early on in the Spires of Iraq questing, Rashad is speaking to Percival, and references a book called 50 Layers of Shadow, a clear reference to 50 Shades of Grey. And sort of peppered in throughout the years, we had the numerous steamy romance novels, which follow the sexual escapades of the male human paladin, Marcus. To date, they have featured his relations with a female human mage, a female Forsaken rogue, a female gnome warlock, a female Draenei jewel crafter, a female goblin riding trainer, 2 Blood Elf sisters, a robot of some sort, a male human stable master, a male and female Tauren couple, a female Kultiran pirate, and a female Red Dragon mage. You can actually encounter Marcus in person walking out of a tent in High Mountain after having had an interaction with the aforementioned Tauren couple. There are also a handful of entries that do not, as far as we know, feature Marcus, but rather other characters, though 2 separate books feature the undead Lord Gravesbane. It would appear that the author of these novels is a human named Noah Scribeson, or at the very least, he's written Stormy Seas and the Lusty Draconian Mage. Given Marcus's verifiable existence in the game, it's unknown just how fictional any of these accounts are or are not. Fortunately, as far as I can tell, and probably because these books are more obscure items that you're less likely to merely stumble upon, they seem to have remained completely untouched, and thank the light for that. And that's all that really springs to mind at the moment, though I'm sure there are plenty more. That being said, the frequency and intensity of such things has certainly diminished over the years. I wouldn't exactly say that's a bad thing, much as I dislike the censorship of what was already in the game, but I hope the devs aren't afraid to continue having fun or even be a bit suggestive. WoW is a video game, after all. To many, an escape. And I don't see the issue with escapism getting a little bit risque. Heck, I'd argue for a large portion of WoW's audience, it can even be a bit healthy. But I've certainly overthought the subject by this point. Let's talk about scantily clad Eridar sisters. As mentioned earlier, these always felt like the sex symbols of Warcraft, even though they're fairly minor characters. But I think they were popular, they were brought back as followers in Legion, and I think Warlocks can even summon them now. However, despite that unofficial title, I don't actually think they're the hottest characters in WoW. I actually am in agreement with the Rachel Green philosophy that sometimes what you don't see is sexier than what you do see. Anyway, there's actually not really anything at all to say about their characterization. They're just Eridar that were made to be sexy. And I drew them in their Witch's Sanctum subzone of the Sunwell Plateau raid where you fight them. I think it turned out pretty well. I made more use of layers than I usually do. And I had some trouble figuring out what I wanted to do for the wall there. For a long time I was working with yellow and white and it just wound up looking like old wallpaper. But I figured out how to make it look better in post, and that was just don't use yellow. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.